Hi, welcome to all of you who are joining us today. My name is Ann Kelly. I am Vice President of Government Relations for Ceres. We're a nonprofit located in Boston. We work with some of the largest investors and companies across the country toward a sustainable economy. Very happy to be with you today on behalf of WW0. I'm thrilled to bring together a couple of distinguished guests for what I think is going to be a lively conversation on Republicans and climate change. First, my old friend, Bob Inglis, who's former congressman, longtime congressman from South Carolina, who's also the founder and CEO of Republican. And as many of you know, Bob has worked tirelessly for years on climate action, and in particular, in mobilizing Republicans around a price on carbon. A warm welcome to you, Bob.
Great to be with you, Ann. Thanks.
I'm also thrilled to be joined by Representative Holly Roshine, who is from Florida. And Holly has had 8 years in the House of Representatives there. She is a mother, she is a fisherman, she is a consensus builder in the House of Representatives. She's deeply devoted to climate action in Florida and is steeped in the knowledge of what's happening in her district in terms of sea level rise. We're going to talk about some of those impacts and her vision for a more stable Florida. A warm welcome to you, Holly.
And fantastic to be with everybody tonight.
So I have two distinguished guests here, but they both agreed ahead of time that I can call them Bob and Holly. We're going to keep this informal. We're going to move quickly. I hope that we're going to be able to go over some of the hardest questions that have come up when it comes to Republicans, their action on climate change, and some of the more vexing questions that we've had to face, as this is obviously urgent in every single sense of the word. So, Bob, I'm going to start with you to kick us off, and I wonder if you can just tell our listeners, some of whom may not know your history, what moved you in particular. I think it had to do with a member of your family. What got you particularly interested in climate change, and what enabled you to take the pretty drastic action that you took with regard to your in your seat as a congressman from South Carolina?
Yeah, it turned out to be drastic back then. I think it's better now. In other words, it's getting more and more acceptable. More and more people like Holly are making the case. So, for 6 years, I said that climate change is nonsense. That was my first 6 years in Congress. Then I was out 6 years doing commercial real estate law. Had the opportunity to run for Congress again in 2004. My son came to me that year. He just turned 18, so he was voting for the first time. And he told me, "Dad, I'll vote for you, but you're going to clean up your act on the environment." So it was a first of a three-step metamorphosis for me. Second step was going to Antarctica with the science committee, seeing the evidence there in the ice core drillings. And then third step, another science committee trip and something of a spiritual awakening, which seems improbable on a godless science committee trip, doesn't it? Because all scientists are godless. Well, apparently not, because this Aussie climate scientist was showing us the Great Barrier Reef, and I could see that he was worshiping God and what he was showing me. And so later we had a chance to talk, and he told me about conservation changes he was making in his life in order to love God and love people. And so I got right inspired. I wanted to be like, who's now become a very dear friend, Scott Heron. I wanted to be like him, loving God and loving people. So I came home and introduced the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon Act of 2009. Not very good timing, as you know, Ann. It seems that there's a Tea Party on. There's a lot of denial in the midst of the Great Recession. And the result was, in a Republican runoff, I got 21% of the vote. 29% of the vote. The other guy got the other 71% of the vote. So then I started on this path of trying to convince conservatives that it's not a heresy to say climate change is real. It's actually rock solid conservatism.
Well, thanks so much for reminding us of that, Bob, and I appreciate that you are framing this in terms of your faith, and we're going to revisit that question. You've written about that recently. I appreciate that. And right away you're raising whether it's conservative or not. Holly, I really like the quote you offered earlier on climate change, which is that if you're living it, it's not partisan. It's real. And I wonder if you can expand on that a little bit and talk about what you have observed in Florida in terms of sea level rise and actual impacts, and how that has shaped your personal determination and vision for Florida.
Thank you, Ann. And Bob is a hard act to follow. Geez. But timing is everything. And I think timing is of the essence right now. Timing is very, very critical. And just a quick aside, growing up in Alaska, that's sort of another extreme end of the changing planet. And then I chose to come back to my roots. My family is originally from Florida and go to Florida State. And right out of school, I got a job in the Florida Keys. This is an amazing archipelago of an incredibly environmentally sensitive world. We've got Everglades. We have some agriculture, and then all of the fabulous Florida Keys, which make up a lot of the third largest reef tract in the world. And we live the impacts of the changing planet every day here, whether we're talking about the oceans warming up and affecting the fisheries, or perhaps when it's rainy season and we see the king tides have an impact on our neighborhoods. And then don't even get me started on the natural disasters that are constantly swirling around the southeastern United States. And, we pray every time one sort of spins up that it's going to miss us. And unfortunately, we just had a big one pass us by, but it affected our neighbors to the northwest in a big way. These rural areas that are extremely economically challenged and maybe not prepared for these changing tides, so to speak. And we hear it from the scuba diving industry. We hear it again, like I mentioned earlier, from the fisheries. We hear it from the tourism side of the issue, where we have tourists that have been diving in the Keys for 30, 40 years, and they've seen the detriment and the degrading of this beautiful ecosystem down here. And at the end of the day, as a fiscal conservative, we as Republicans, and again, I don't really see this as a partisan issue, and we can get into that more moving forward, but the economic impacts are big.
Mm-hmm. So you said you don't see it as a partisan issue. Do you feel like the economic issues have really been the bridge builder? Has that what's transcended the partisan divide in Florida? Is it fair to say that you've got a bipartisan consensus toward action in Florida at this point?
Yes, and I think that's a major component. And, resiliency is sort of the new kid on the block. Everybody wants to talk about being resilient. You see counties and municipalities across our state, and I know other states, hiring their own chief resiliency officers and so on and so forth, and starting to talk about this. We've been talking about it in Southeast Florida for a long, long time. We have a very neat bipartisan 4-county compact, and that's Palm Beach County, Broward County, Miami-Dade County, and Monroe County. And every year that compact gets together and they bring in stakeholders from all across the globe, all across the nation, from the electrical industry to the water industry, the scientists, the philanthropists, the economic directors of these associations come together, and we talk about and we compare and contrast what all these different places are doing, and how can we, not just talk about it, what's going to be the plan and what are we going to do about it?
Would you say there's more comfort in talking about resilience than there is in talking about actual emissions reduction? You said earlier that at this point, the word climate change is quite common in Florida, that the real estate industry has embraced it fully. Is the state looking at a renewable portfolio standard? Are you setting goals for the state in terms of actual emissions reduction?
Yes, and you see different industries across the state doing that. Again, whether it's the utilities industry, like you mentioned, the real estate industry, which is that's having a real impact. Not even 10 years ago, it was still a big deal to buy a home on the bay or the ocean. And now that the waters are starting to rise, that is having a maybe not a negative effect yet, but people are certainly starting to take that into consideration. And I think that, whatever it takes to help you sleep at night, if you want to talk about it in the frame or, through the lens of resiliency, if you want to talk about climate change, resiliency is sort of a big umbrella, not just talking about the climate. I mean, we got to talk about transportation, and now we're going through a pandemic. So you have, healthcare. I mean, there's so many things that go into being resilient, other than what we're discussing right now in the Keys, and that's physically lifting up roads. So depending on where you're at, whether you're in Florida, North, Central, South Florida, you're in South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, I mean, California, wherever you are, the conversation is different. However, I am so encouraged and pleased that it's sort of thrust itself to the forefront.
Yeah, well, that's inspiring. I'm sure it is for our listeners. And you're right that resilience can be the on-ramp to a conversation that goes much deeper, and sometimes it's an easier on-ramp. I'm wondering, Bob, having heard what Holly had to say, it sounds like there's a growing consensus in Florida toward action. She's suggesting that it's not as partisan in the state as you may have seen elsewhere. Can you talk a little about what you're hearing from your conservative colleagues? Are you seeing the outrage that you're seeing among Democrats, to be candid? Are you feeling the kind of urgency and impatience among your conservative colleagues to really grab the mantle of climate action and get something done? And I'd love it if you can make a distinction about younger versus older Republicans. Obviously, you're very young, Bob, but I mean, let's just talk about those who are, dare I say, over 55 versus under 40. Is there a distinction there?
Wow, yeah, several things to unpack there. First of all, Holly is reflective of why it is that we're focused on Florida as one of our key states, as you are, and at Ceres, that Florida is feeling the impacts, as Holly was just saying. So, and as to whether the intensity of the left is reflected on the right, I think the answer to that is no, not yet. We don't have people as surely not displaying outrage about climate change impacts coming our way. Rather, there's maybe a growing awareness is where I'd put it. So there is an intensity gap between, the people that are the Green New Deal, let's say, and people that are becoming aware of the problem. I think that part of that's personality, if I might say. It's a difference between a liberal personality and conservative personality, perhaps. I remember at a town hall meeting, a lady asked me if I was afraid. And I said, no, ma'am, I'm aware, but I am not afraid. I really wanted to keep on, continue with that thought, which was, if I were afraid, I'd be about as useless as you are at this moment, because, she was just afraid. And that's not helpful to run around saying that the building's on fire. No, tell us where the exits are, calmly. Tell us where the exits are. And so some of this is personality, right? I mean, there's a sort of a conservative personality that says, what we want here is some responsible people, sensible people to show us where the exits are. The building is on fire. Now let's find the exits. And so, but I'm grateful for the left having intensity, because we need that. And maybe it causes a political response on the right to get a little bit more aware and a little bit more outspoken about it. So that's going on. But then I'd say to the last part of your question there, Ann, yes, more intensity among young conservatives like Holly than among older conservatives like me. My age group and older, a little bit more hesitant, eco-hesitant, as we got the term from our friend Lindsay Linsky recently. So there's a difference there in age. And we need, that's where, cultures that succeed in change are ones that can listen to young people. Ones that can't listen to young people and can't adapt are the ones that really fall behind. So the question is now, can America listen to the young people who are telling us, really, our futures are at stake? So how about grandpa and grandma? Get with it.
Absolutely. Can you walk us through your experience of showing conservatives the exits in your calm, beautiful storytelling voice? How's that work for you?
Well, I think it's We do deal with solution aversion is what we think. Solution aversion is when, psychiatrists and psychologists use that term. It means that when you don't have a solution that fits with your values or what you think will work, you deny the existence of the problem. It sounds irrational, but all of us do it every day. So, here's a plan of surgery for that back problem you're having. First, we're going to take your head off. After we got your head off, we're going to work on your spine. Then we're going to put your head back on. Thanks, doc. I'm feeling a lot better. I don't have a back problem. If that's your solution, I don't have a problem. And so when you think about climate change, conservatives heard it this way. The UN, blue helmets on, is going to come to the EPA, and they're going to regulate our very breath. Okay, then, there's nothing in that paragraph attractive to conservatives. And so conservatives say, if that's your solution, I must not have a problem. And so that's what we got to do is you got to say, okay, now, really, we do have a problem. The problem is the water is coming up on the Keys. I mean, just how I say, it's coming up. And so let's deal with that. But let's deal with it in a way that honors free enterprise principles. And that's what we're big on at republican.org, as you know.
I'm glad you said breath, because I was thinking about the Clean Air Act, and I wanted to ask you both about one of the prize jewels of our environmental law infrastructure, passed unanimously by the Senate in December 1970, Republicans and Democrats unanimously, and then strengthened by George H.W. Bush in 1990, a vital statute that allows us to breathe today. If you've been to countries that don't have a Clean Air Act, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So it was a phenomenal job generator. It was a technology forcing statute that's been stunningly successful for what it was designed to do, which was to clean the air. Can you reflexively, do you feel that your Republican colleagues would have kind of a reflexive negative reaction in talking about something like the Clean Air Act? Or is there a general, mature appreciation for that's command and control that actually really worked? Is there any kind of appreciation? And I could say from the Clean Air Act, I could talk about the Clean Water Act, I could talk about the National Environmental Policy Act, or talk about the aversion that may exist when a statute like that comes up, that was established in the Nixon administration.
Yeah. Holly, why don't you talk about that?
My response will be very brief. I mean, who doesn't want clean air? It's like a no-brainer. Again, going back to the bipartisanship of this sort of public policy, and I don't mean to be insensitive. I'm not being insensitive in my response. It's very serious, and like you mentioned, in communities across the world that don't have this sort of framework in place, it's a mess. And I think that, moving forward, we need this solid sort of foundation to keep us going in a forward movement. And, not that we're going to expect a nationwide resiliency bill. Here's everything wrapped up in a bow. If you're going to build a new building or a house, you're going to have to stick to these guidelines. I don't know. I think we're a little far away from that, but there are certainly these sort of pillars of policy that was set decades ago. And if we can move forward in a meaningful way on air and water, right? Can't live without air, can't live without water. Well, we certainly can't live underwater. So let's start talking about that. And I just wanted to, before Bob responds, because I'm sure he's going to have a much more eloquent response than I did, maybe we could touch on later, talking about the next generations and the worries as a mom to an 8-year-old. What does resiliency, Bob and his grandkids, what does that sort of look like? But that's an aside. I'd love to hear Bob's response to the Clean Air Act.
Yeah, well, I think
pretty eloquent too, Holly. But go ahead, Bob.
Yes, that's because the eloquence you just stated was mom of an 8-year-old. I think that's what's getting people. That's what builds support and for the Clean Air Act is, if you got a family member that suffers with asthma, it's real personal about air quality. And so, we want clean air. I had an interesting experience one time in Pittsburgh. I was being driven to the University of Pittsburgh by a guy named Joey. Joey when he was younger. And he said he went to the steel mill to see his dad and his uncle. He needed to take something to him. This is a long time ago because he could walk in the steel mill. And so he got there and he said he saw two humanoids there in the cloud of smoke or whatever. And he said his uncle pulled down his mask and said, "Hey, Joey." And then it's only then he realized, oh, that's my dad and my uncle. So he gave him whatever it was. And the uncle told him, "Joey, we're going to get you a job here someday." And Joey told me, he said, no, he goes by Joe. He said, and he owns a transportation company. He says, "I decided right then and there to read." He said, "I didn't want that job."
That's great.
Hey, I want that job. I didn't want, he said, that looked bad. And, so now the problem is that those emissions are in Beijing. Those emissions are in Guangdong. Those emissions are in China, and we're importing their stuff. And so that's what we got to fix now is, emissions anywhere or climate change everywhere. And so Pittsburgh is now a very clean city. You go there and they got these bridges over clean water and it's clean air, and it's about self-driving cars and Carnegie Mellon and wow, and a healthcare city. I'm sound like I'm from the Chamber of Commerce at Pittsburgh, but anyway, it's a great place, right? And it's so changed, and part of it, and was cleaning up the air. The street lights came on at noon, Joey told me. And he said, you took 2 shirts to work. I mean, he started out other businesses besides steel. He said, you took 2 white shirts and you changed at noon because your first white shirt was gray by noon. That's what we lived with. That's what people in China are living with now. There's 7 years less of life expectancy for them. So what a success. America cleaned up its air. Now we got a big problem with climate change because you got to get the whole world in on it. We got Pittsburgh in on it and other cities in America, but now in climate, we got to get the whole world in on this thing.
Absolutely. And in a moment, I'll ask you about your thinking around a border adjusted carbon price. But Holly, let's pick up on what you said earlier. I'd love to hear about your responsibility as a mom of an 8-year-old and how that affects your vision and your work and your steadfast commitment.
Thank you. And I have to give him a shout out. Drake is my son. He's a 8.5-year-old little boy, and he's going through virtual school right now, which is why I dropped him off at tennis practice so that he could burn some energy that he sort of, banks during the day of virtual school. So, but no, and why are we doing this? Why are we worrying about this? Because right now, we're fine, right? The sun comes up, we've got water to drink, we have food to eat, and we might be okay. But what about our children? What about their children? What about their children's children? And I know that's sort of maybe cliche, but it is the truth. And if we don't sort of get going on this in a pretty fast fashion, I think that they're going to be making up for our resting on our laurels. And I think now that we're seeing the impacts in such a big way, we can be doing so many more things in Florida, in the U.S. as Bob mentioned, globally, to sort of curtail some of the more negative effects that could be right around the corner, or as we're sort of peeking around that corner, we're seeing. And in Florida, we're very much a water state, right? We have the Everglades, we have beaches, we have springs. It's just, and the leaps and the bounds that we've made in the last, I'd say, decade have really moved the needle. That's in one silo, right? Water quality. You've seen the electrical industry really take ownership of solar power. We're the Sunshine State. We should be leading in solar, and we're moving the needle. There might be some other states that say, no, we're doing way more than you are, Florida, but we're we're doing it in a proactive way. We're bringing the consumer to the table. And I think, once we really make a big pivot to climate change, we can sort of bring all of that together and move forward in a big way that will have a lasting impact, and that our children and our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren will say, man, I'm glad grandma and grandpa were on top of that, because whew, that would have been a crisis. That would have been a real tough one.
Yeah, well, clearly, Holly, you need to be out talking to college young Republicans, because I think you're going to inspire them all. But you said earlier that you would like it if Florida could actually possibly be a model as a coastal state. And I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about that and what your vision is.
Yeah, so it's a no-brainer to me. And again, I have Florida right here on top of my heart. And though I won't forget my Alaska roots, I don't want to ignore my Alaskan friends and family. But we are the epicenter, right? We've got fisheries, we have Everglades, we have tourism, we have springs, like I mentioned before, we have the sunshine, we have natural disasters, we have sea level rise. If it's going on in Florida right now. And again, let's not be insensitive to the pandemic that everybody is going through right now. We have a very robust economy pre-COVID, but it's starting to come back. We have low taxes. We are very veteran and military friendly. We have agriculture. Again, we've got it going on in the state of Florida. And if you ask me, we have it going on in a gearing up sort of way when it comes to resiliency and the impacts of the changing planet, climate change.
And when you say gearing up, I sense a bit of hesitation in your voice. I'm wondering if what you're getting at is that not every person has been convinced. And I want to ask you both what you say, and I know you've both done this, and I think you've both been very good at it. When you meet conservative colleagues who just say, I just don't really believe it. I believe America has always figured stuff out. We are going to get this done. I don't believe in the urgency. Many of them could be people of faith who very well-intentioned say to you, I believe that God will provide. Slow down. Let's just take it easy. I don't always believe what academics tell me. The economy first, personal rights first. Don't like rules and regs. Don't tell me what to do. And really want to promote a go slow approach. How do you win those folks over so effectively?
You want me to take that first, Bob? Or
You go, Holly. Yeah.
No, and I completely, as a libertarian at heart, I completely understand that. But we also can't, be an ostrich and stick our head in the sand on this one. And again, living in a place where we see it day by day, it's a no-brainer. And when I talk about sort of gearing up for the next big step, and it's about a plan, right? Everybody loves a plan. I love to have a list, and I love to check everything off on my list. Then I know that I can move forward to whatever the next, thing to do is. And we have a wonderful transportation plan in the state of Florida. We have a work plan. The Department of Transportation knows exactly what they need to do, how much money they need to ask for the next 5 years, for the next 10 years. Do we have that, for water? Does the state of Florida that depends on clean water and water sources, and that's, again, so environmentally sensitive, do we have a plan for water? And I think that there are other issues out there for other states that they wish that they had a roadmap, going back to my DOT example. And I think there's a way to get that. And is it going to be concrete? Is everything we do in terms of a climate change plan or a resiliency plan, is it going to be perfect? No, it's just like this pandemic. We've had to bob and weave. What worked 2 months ago isn't necessarily working this month. And I think as resilient Americans, we can do that. And this is a very evolving topic. And I think people need to understand that, especially maybe the faith community. I'm a faithful person. I'm a believer. And God also gave us free will to not just sit there and do nothing. And I think that, whether you need to work on messaging and be more targeted in our approach, we can do that. You can't speak to, like you mentioned, Anne, to college students the same way that you might speak to a senior audience, and that's up to people like Bob and I to get that and to sort of spread that message and bring more ambassadors onto our team.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Your thoughts, Bob?
Yeah, and those ambassadors can be very effective, especially to their parents and grandparents, because it's a bond of love that they have with their parents, their grandparents, and those young conservatives really are. There's an additional reason for focusing on them, and that is that they can reach their parents. And it's interesting, Holly, that you mentioned head in the sand, because John Kasich, here we are on World War Zero's screen, and John just wrote an op-ed with that allusion. So that sounds like something that I would hear from my friend John. I think, and that the way that I find helps conservatives engage is to talk simply about accountability, and because it's a quite a watchword for conservatives. We believe in accountability, and conservatives generally believe that accountability brings blessings. Havoc results from the lack of accountability, and climate change is that havoc. That's the issue, the underlying issue. So what, and Holly just mentioned this libertarian thought, and we at republican.org do tend a little bit toward that libertarian side of things, on this, because what we say is, in the salad bar of life, take what you want, but pay for what you take. If you do, then the restaurateur can have some sliced turkey at the end of that salad bar and some nice olives and nice cheese. But if you let free riders walk off the end of that salad bar without paying, well, that restaurateur is going to be left with iceberg lettuce and Thousand Island dressing and maybe some croutons on that salad bar. That's all they can afford to have there. Because if you don't pay for what you take, you can't have a robust life. You can't have, things don't work right. And so that's what it is in climate change. We got to pay for the space that we're taking in the atmosphere. If you do, Milton Friedman would tell us, if he were still alive, it'll work out, because people will start limiting themselves. The reason that all of our 5 children the Inglis family knows how to handle a salad bar. Here's what you do. You go get spinach first, has no weight. Then you get all the mushrooms you want, no weight. Parmesan cheese, great. Cantaloupe, no way. Watermelon, no way. That's all water and it's all expensive. So honest goodness, you watch our 5 kids go to a salad bar, they know the English method. Okay, so if you pay, that's the point about the atmosphere too, is once people figure out that, you're gonna have to pay for this, you're gonna have to pay for the space that you're taking up in the trash dump at the sky. Ooh, get the spinach, get the light stuff. In other words, go light. Figure out a way to get solar power on your roof. Figure out a way to get one of Elon Musk's batteries in your garage. Get one of his cars and drive around. All these things you start doing, not because some government regulator rolled by in a government sedan and told you what to do, but rather because you're just seeing the true cost of things. And then you start acting in enlightened self-interest. So that was pretty high-octane conservatism I was giving you there, Ann. I mean, it's like, it's a real belief in the free enterprise system is what I was just describing.
Really helpful. Great allusion. I will keep the salad bar metaphor close. Building on the libertarian theme, it sounds like you would both then support ending one regulatory model that's been in place a long time, which is subsidies to fossil fuel companies. Is that true?
Absolutely. As far as we're concerned at republican.org, eliminate all the subsidies for all the fuels. And this gets sort of controversial. If I go to a conservative crowd and I say, no more electric car credits, right. No more production tax credit for wind, right. No more investment tax credit for solar, yeah. And then you get into the harder things. And no more under market leases on public land for the extraction of minerals. Right. comes the response. And then no more the biggest subsidy of them all, which is being able to dump into the trash dump of the sky without paying a tipping fee. Crickets, okay? It's still a little bit crickets coming back from the, as I call out across the Tea Party or the Trump fence on that. So now there will come a time, though, I think conservatives reassert themselves and say, that just makes sense. Is you got to pay for what you take, and you got to, you know, that's how people will regulate themselves. So you don't have to have a government regulator come visit with them, because they regulate themselves. That's why, yes, we would eliminate all those subsidies, and on the level playing field, have free enterprise deliver innovation faster than government regulations or fickle tax incentives could ever imagine.
I hear that. I want to press you on that last point, government regulations, free enterprise. I want to go back to, you do believe in the economic and job generating nature of the Clean Air Act regulations, I hope. That was a regulation, again, passed in a Republican administration, that's just been stunningly effective, both in its purpose and in, again, spurring American innovation and technology. So there is a there, right? I mean, I don't know. Do you want to draw such a contrast between regulation bad, free market good? Is it not a bit more nuanced than that?
Well, in the case of climate change especially, you can either regulate it, you can incentivize it, or you can price it. We're big into pricing because the regulation and the incentivizing are American only, and this is a worldwide problem. You want to get into that later, I think. But if it isn't enough, then yes, you do have to fall back on regulation. But what we would say as conservatives is, first, try the pricing method. And if it doesn't work, then maybe you got to fall back on regulating. So for example, fugitive emissions of methane, maybe the pricing isn't going to be enough to stop that. And maybe you got to regulate, therefore, those fugitive emissions. Okay, that may be what you have to do. Maybe the price signal on gasoline at, say, a $25 per ton price on carbon dioxide results in a 21 cent per gallon increase in the price of gasoline. Maybe that's not enough of a price signal to change behavior. If so, then maybe you got to continue raising CAFE standards. Those things. So in other words, you do end up with a mix of policies. But what we're saying about climate change is, since it's so unique as a worldwide problem, you got to figure out a way to get the world in on it. And that, we think, is most effective through pricing.
And on that note, Bob, could you build on that a little bit and talk about the necessity of border adjustments? Because that kind of gets to the heart of the matter.
Yeah. So, when I was saying you can regulate, you can incentivize it. Those things, they're good people that talk about those things. The Green New Deal is a regulatory approach, essentially. And they're patriotic Americans who are trying to accomplish good things. The weakness we'd point out to them, though, is not just that we don't like regulations at republican.org. We'd point out that it only applies in America. You can't get China to be subject to our regulations. Then you can try to incentivize it. That means give tax benefits to American corporations to do good things. Well, that's good, but you can't get India you can't incentivize an Indian corporation to do the same thing because they don't pay American taxes. So now the answer that those people would give back to me, and what I'm saying right here, is, yeah, but if we incentivize it in America, the price is going to come down because it's going to create a market here, and then we're going to be able to sell it in India. Maybe I'd say back, if there are enough customers. But if you have maybe 10, 20,000 companies in the world that do power production, you don't have a very big market. So I'm not sure the prices come down like they say it did for, say, cell phones, where you have 7 billion people who'd like to have a cell phone. So that leaves you with a third approach, which is, we think, is the one that's so exciting, which is pricing it. And that means a tax. Oh my gosh, there's a guy that just mentioned a tax and he's conservative. Who would be interested in a new tax? Well, very special tax. We cut taxes somewhere else, so there's no growth of government, or we dividend all the money from the revenue, from the carbon tax revenue to the citizenry. So it's revenue neutral. And then you make it border adjustable. That means you apply the tax on imports if they're coming from a country that doesn't have the same price on carbon dioxide. China would object in the World Trade Organization. That's an impermissible tariff, they'd say. We think they lose based on precedents in the chemical industry that say you can have a tax. It's based on the stuff coming in, a content tax. And this would be a content tax. So a sheet of flat steel is coming through, say, the port of Miami right now. We apply the tax. They object in the World Trade Organization. They lose. 24 hours later, they in China have the same price on carbon dioxide. Why? Because they just paid a tax in Miami that's being sent now to Washington, D.C. If they'd collected a tax in China, the money would have ended up in Beijing, and the sheet of flat steel would have come through the port of Miami with no adjustment. So 24 hours later, they've got the same price on carbon dioxide. And then you got the whole world following. And this is important for conservatives. Anne and Holly, you check me out to see if you find this true among your constituents. And I realize I'm on John Kerry's screen here, and he's the Secretary of State and very much into international agreements. But the beauty of what I just described for conservatives is there'd be no international agreement. It's just a bold move by the United States. It says we're going to act, and we're going to make it in your interest to follow our lead. If you want to keep on paying our carbon tax on entry into that Miami port, go right ahead. We got a $3 trillion annual deficit right now and like a $27 trillion debt. So please, China, go ahead and pay our carbon tax. But they probably decide to do it themselves. And then no international agreement. But by the way, just a footnote, we do agree with Secretary Kerry that we should not leave the Paris Accord. We should stay in that and help lead the world. It at least establishes a will. What I've just described is a way. The way is what you need after you have a will. But so long explanation, but that's the idea of a border adjustment. And by the way, it's what almost everybody is for. That's not controversial, what I've just said. Left and right. I mean, I'm putting all this in conservative terms. But if somebody's out there listening, they think, hey, that guy Inglis, he's from that red state of South Carolina. He says he's conservative, but all what he just said sounds familiar. Now I'm a progressive, say in California. Well, it might be that what I've just described is the same thing that Al Gore has been for about 30 years. That's been his solution. And so really, we can bring America together and lead the world to a solution here. And it's why World War Zero is doing great work with John Kasich and Governor Schwarzenegger and John Kerry. It's really great to see those parties coming together.
Well, thanks for reminding me, Bob, that our listeners should certainly know that what Bob just described is very, very much a robustly bipartisan idea. The Citizens Climate Lobby nationwide does a record-breaking advocacy day every year for a carbon tax. Again, that would be revenue neutral. And economists have agreed, a record number of economists have agreed worldwide about the efficiency of a carbon price. The designs matter, of course, but there are many, many models. In fact, there's many pieces of legislation filed at the federal level. So nothing Bob suggested, just so our listeners know, is at all outrageous. I'm curious how it comes across to you, Holly, as you think about, there have been some proposals to price carbon at a state level. We've certainly looked at some models here in Massachusetts. Washington State has famously looked at a few. I'm curious to know if it's ever come up in Florida as a model, if there are any discussions within your caucus about pricing carbon statewide, how you think those discussions might go. We just love your feedback as a general matter.
Sure. So the way where Bob was going is way out of my wheelhouse, and I'm just kind of sitting here listening. And so I definitely want to stay in my lane. And I can answer with a pretty firm no. We haven't really had formal discussions at the state level of moving forward in that sense. However, what I can bring to the table is a huge fan of deregulation, big fan of empowering the private sector to sort of, whether you want to talk about incentives or subsidies and things like that, those are certainly, icing on the cake. But empowering the private sector and private enterprise to do what they do and to sort of get out there and solve the problem. I don't think that anybody rejects the idea that the private sector or doesn't want to do an amazing job. And we see it right here in our state with the water industry or the utility industry. They're putting their best foot forward. Now, could we do better? Absolutely. And I think, again, going back to my angle of us being a leader, absolutely. When you get into the sort of the more international discussions, that's a little more complicated and would rely on a lot of buy-in from all the states. But again, America has been a leader in so many things. Why should we not be a leader in this? And if you're going to do business with the United States of America, you should be held to the highest standards possible. And I think that there is a way to accomplish that. Again, I want to stay in my lane and not get out of what I can speak to confidently. But I'm buying what you're selling. And I think that, again, it comes back to messaging. It comes back to who's your target audience. And people need to feel comfortable to start to talk about this. Because when I first heard carbon tax, I was like, even made me squirm in my chair. It's not something that just rolls off your tongue that you talk to about with your grandma at the kitchen table. Even though my grandma would be a huge fan, we don't see eye to eye on a lot of things. She's a little more liberal than I am. God bless her. Love you, Grandma. But I think that, again, the needle is starting to move. And speaking of needles, how do we thread that needle? And that's why we're having this conversation now.
Yeah, and I might add, there's a reason, of course, that it hasn't come into Holly's wheelhouse yet in the State House in Florida, and that is there's the Achilles heel of state efforts on carbon taxes, and it is their inability as a state to do a border adjustment. This was what I believe killed some other things too, killed Washington State twice in this. Is that only the federal government can impose this border adjustment. Under the Constitution, only the federal government has that power. And so absent that, if I were still in Congress and you gave me a carbon tax that internalizes a negative externality, in other words, makes it so we see the true cost of burning fossil fuels, and you made it border adjustable, you gave me my favorite, which would be cut payroll taxes in equal amount so that people get a bigger paycheck. We still fund Social Security through the carbon tax, so we don't hurt it. If you gave me that, but then you said it's not border adjustable, though, Bob, I couldn't vote for it, even though I'm a big climate advocate. Because I used to represent a wonderful manufacturing district here in South Carolina, and it would be untrue to my people to not say, now listen, what Holly just said is right. If you're going to do business with America, you're going to have to achieve our standards on this. And here's where, okay, so some conservatives out there are now getting a little bit squeamish about what I'm saying, because they're saying, what, are you going to apply wage and hour laws too, and safety standards around the world? Well, those might be good for people to follow our lead on those. But in climate, the unique thing is, again, emissions anywhere, climate change everywhere. So we have really a calling and a right to insist on what Holly was just saying, that if you're going to do business in America, if you're going to sell that flat steel here, you got to pay the carbon tax, because, yeah, we're using your steel, but you produce CO2 in that process, and we want to see the true cost on that steel. And so border adjustment, that's the problem with state initiatives on this. It's a hard sell to a state, but it's not a hard sell in the federal government, because the federal government can do the border adjustment.
If it's not a hard sell at the federal level, Bob, then what would you say about how difficult it's been to get to the heart of the matter, to move Republicans on this topic? What would you say has been the most difficult? And I know there've been some Republican colleagues who even 10 years ago were a bit more supportive and now have moved. What would be your guidance to our listeners, some of whom may be from states where they have Republican congressmen and women or senators that they can persuade?
Well, I think, here's the thing about politicians. Holly, I'm sure, accepted, but I'm a recovering politician, so I'll say to myself,
Public
politician.
servants, public
Yeah,
servants.
there we go. There we go. We're afraid of the people we represent, but we're terrified of the activists within our own party, because those are the people who can toss you out in a primary. And if you lose in a primary, there's no home to go home to. If you lose in the general, they'll let you speak at the next party dinner, because you were the one that went out and carried the flag, and yeah, you lost to the other side, but we love you. No, you lose in a primary, they don't invite you to come speak at the dinner. And so you're a person without a country at that point, right? And so that's the fear, and is that there's the Merchants of Doubt, and the wonderful book by Naomi Oreskes, a film by Robbie Kenner, that really details this, how some people with some interest spent some well-timed money in the midst of the Great Recession to create doubt where there wasn't any doubt. And those people really succeeded. I mean, you got to hand it to them. They pulled off a marketing feat in creating this doubt. That doubt is still with us. So now it's going away some, but it's still strong in some parts of the Republican Party, my party. And that's the fear of those people in those primaries, the activists in the party that might turn you out if you say too full-throatedly that we need to do something about climate change. But here's the good news.
Those people need to meet Holly, okay? I think Holly could convince any of them.
That's right.
It's not partisan if you live it. Remember that quote.
Yes, that's true. And I'd say this, it's changing. And Holly, you check me out on this too. I got tossed out in 2010, but those are the darkest days of the Great Recession. We've all had more experiences with climate change, the ones that Holly was just describing since then. We're more convinced. But also, the political realities have become real convincing to people like Kevin McCarthy, my friend, the Republican leader of the U.S. Congress, U.S. House. Kevin held a conference in January of this year, pre-COVID, where 100 Republicans attended, and he basically said to them, we Republicans need to change on climate change, because we're never going to win these suburban districts back with a retro position on climate change. So the political realities are changing, but there's still some districts where it's hard. But the good news, we think, in Florida is there are districts where it's becoming more and more imperative for a Republican to address this and to sound much more like Holly.
That's what we need, more people who sound like Holly. Holly, on this note, I'm aware that you shepherded an important piece of legislation through the House of Representatives in Florida. I think it was last year. One of your colleagues was telling me about it. What that tells me is that you are somebody who believes in laws. And so can you talk a little bit about the kind of legislation that can get through, the kind of regulations that can get through that address this problem and are still within the parameters that you seek to allow necessary free enterprise? I mean, I come from this representing companies who seek rules. I work Capitol Hill for companies who are saying, we need rules that'll get us access to renewable energy. We need rules that will fix climate change. They're for carbon pricing for sure, but they also have a more expansive view that I think is probably necessary at the state level, as Bob says. So I'd be curious to get your thoughts on, again, and what has made Florida the model coastal state. You know, what are the kinds of measures that you think people can get behind and have gotten behind through your leadership?
Sure, thank you. And it's been a real honor and a pleasure to work in this space over the last 8 years. And then, I was a former legislative assistant for almost 10 years. sort of working in the same space. I worked for a Republican first, and actually my second boss was a Democrat, former minority leader of the Florida House. So it's been interesting sort of watching that. And I was an assistant during the Great Recession. So, having a budget where there was nothing, and then having a budget where there was lots to spend was an interesting challenge and lesson to learn in the process. But working in the space of water quality or working in the space of environmental regulation is critical, I think, in this conversation. And sort of, I know these are laws that we're passing, right? Laws are in the books. I mean, my computer right now is on a stack of statute books right now, because that's what we found to sort of line up my view. But I think that they're a framework that allows the private enterprise and the municipalities and the counties and the state alike to sort of move forward in a meaningful and a balanced way. And as we mentioned earlier, what's very important in the Conservative Party is accountability. And so, not that we want these laws to be cumbersome or to sort of be a hurdle to moving forward or progress. These are the bills that I've worked on. This is my opinion. There might be others out there that disagree with me, and that's fine. Where it's America, you don't have to believe everything that, you can have differences of opinion, but they are bills and pieces of legislation that provide a framework and moving forward on these important sort of kind of policies. One bill that I passed was the 404 regulation that the Department of Environmental Protection and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the state can maybe get something a little, done a little more quickly than maybe the feds can. And so when you allow the state to sort of take a leadership role in these certain sort of arena, these policy areas, whether it's permitting for docks or wetland mitigation, this happened to be a big deal for the 404 issue. It allows the federal government to sort of go focus on things that they need to be doing while allowing states that know what is happening in their backyard better than the federal government does to move forward. And we have the private sector who has been waiting for, I heard horror stories of years for this said permit to mitigate what they wanted to do. That was a fantastic project, but they're taking into account the effects that maybe this said project would have on the environment. Here's our plan. We're not only going to make this better, we're going to leave it amazing. And I was so pleased. I had no idea what 404 meant, by the way, when I first, people are like, oh, Holly's going to do the 404 bill. I'm like, oh, great. Sounds awesome. Well, then obviously having worked on the issue, I learned a lot more. And I think the more that we can empower states to sort of do those sort of things, the better off that we will be in allowing the feds to do what they need to do while the states can do what they need to do for their residents, for their constituency. Absolutely.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And what's hard for me is I've got 1,000 more questions to ask you both. I think I have to ask WW0 next time for 3 hours if we're going to have folks talented as you both. I have to close now, but I want to thank you both for your very candid comments and just remind our listeners that the recording of today's conversation will be available through WW0 and our colleagues there. And both of you, Bob and Holly, just please keep up the good work. We know that you're completely committed. We need you both more now than ever, and hope you two can do a roadshow some point across the country to get to a vast group of audiences, young and old. Thanks so much to both of you.
Thanks, Ann. Great to be with you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Ann.
Holly. See ya.
Thank you.